Hello. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody joining us online today to this In Conversation event hosted by the Centre for Religion in Society at York St John University. I'm Professor Esther McIntosh, the Associate Head of the School of Humanities for Programmes in Religion, Politics and International Relations. And I'm delighted to be in conversation tonight with Jared Stacy. Jared is an American pastor and a current PhD student at the University of Aberdeen. His research focuses on the intersection of theology and political conspiracies in American evangelicalism. From 2016 to 2020, Jared was a youth pastor at an evangelical Southern Baptist church. During that time, Jared witnessed the spread of conspiracy theories, but found his church leaders reluctant to get involved in challenging the disinformation. In order to gain some critical distance, he left his job in the church and his home in the US not long before the insurrection at the Capitol. So, welcome, Jared. Just to let the audience know, I will ask Jared a few questions, then you will also have a chance to ask your own questions. You can type in the Q&A. There is a little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We currently also have live captions turned on. So again, in the three dots at the bottom of your screen, you can select subtitles if you wish to see those, but you can also turn them off if you don't want to. Should your Wi-Fi be at all glitchy, the live captions sometimes help to pick up on the conversation, even when the screen might freeze for you. We are recording the event. It will be posted on the YSJ YouTube. However, you don't have to worry as an audience. Your cameras are not on, your microphone is not on, so it's not actually recording you. Okay, so Jared, can you tell me about your life in the US and as a pastor before you ever heard mention of conspiracy theories?
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me, Esther. You know, I can probably describe it as going down a river. You know, I was very much in the stream of white evangelicalism. There were probably two major tributaries that fed that, in my experience in that stream, the first being a fundamentalism, and then the other was reformed. And so both those tributaries for me kind of coalesced, came together to form one stream. You know, I attended Jerry Falwell's Liberty University. From there, went and served as a pastor in New Orleans, and we can talk about that. It'll probably come up later. But my experience in New Orleans among people radically changed and redirected kind of my perception of the faith that I inherited. From there, we moved back into Virginia, and so now we're here. And so in many ways, my time in that stream and growing up was a mixture, right, of good and bad. Our theological inheritance is always a mixture of both. And so being critical about that stream and that tradition does require very much separating as best as we can the wheat from the chaff, and parsing that is a good and necessary work. But I'm well aware of how easy it is to probably move into a polemic when it comes to that label, white evangelical, or what evangelical means in the United States. And I think it's a necessary conversation. So I say that to basically describe myself in those terms, but then also to critically kind of put an asterisk there to say there's a necessary and important conversation about what it means now to be an evangelical, what it has meant in the past. And that's part of the work that I find myself taking up and joining here.
Sure, yeah, especially seems to have shifted quite a lot in America and seems to be developing in different camps. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. So when did you first start to hear talk of conspiracy theories in the church, and what sorts of conspiracies were you hearing at that time?
Yeah, I've asked this question before, and I think the answer that I've developed has been kind of a little bit of both. I can remember growing up in this tradition, various points where conspiratorial thinking was very much part and parcel of the tradition. And so to recall specifically in the 2020, what I started to hear also kind of bounces off of those moments. I do remember right after 9/11, distinctly sitting and hearing a missionary returning actually from the UK, who basically shared a quote unquote sermon that amounted to a Islamophobia type gospel, and this idea that there was going to be an ethnic takeover in the United States. And so riding that post 9/11 nationalist fervor, and so I kind of use that as a qualifier to saying, specifically in 2020, you started to see particular moves really when the pandemic started, but also coalescing with the death and the murder of George Floyd, and various ways to explain that particular event. And obviously, as 2020 went on, you started to see claims about election fraud, or even the assertion that it was going to be fraudulent. I think we kind of forget that. There was very much a expectation that the election was going to be attempted to be stolen before claims that the election was stolen actually happened. So those were things that you heard. Those were things that mainly you saw digitally. Remember, we're all still in lockdown for in processing information digitally. And so I do point to those two things with that qualifier that it's very much part of the tradition. Maybe not a bug as much as a feature in how we interpret events and how we posture ourselves. But when it came to 2020, specifically George Floyd had that moment was brought up kind of a concern for sex trafficking, as the conversation about race is happening over here. What about sex trafficking? And so that was one specific thing that I do remember, especially through and this is the difficult thing, through the algorithm, right? Seeing that, and then kind of going back and forth between how people were processing these real world events and how that impacted or intersected with a Christian posture and presence in the world.
So even though that, that particular conspiracy theory about the paedophile ring, the cabal at the highest echelons of sort of power in America, that goes back to the 2016 presidential campaign and Trump, but it wasn't really featuring for you until 2020.
No. And like I said, you hear not full-blown embraces of it, but side comments or whispers or Facebook posts that you can scroll past. But look at that, that's maybe how they're processing it. But when it came through an election and these things started to really impact a collective response to our community, that started to become more of an issue.
Okay, so also in 2020, had you heard of QAnon then? Were people talking about QAnon then? Or were these conspiracy theories seen as something separate from QAnon? Well, like, when did that?
Yeah, that's a good question. They were disparate, mentions of Antifa or this idea that there would be a sweeping away. All the things that reporting and research have since brought together as determinative of QAnon. I'm referencing the PRI report that just came out this week that kind of proves that QAnon has had some staying power among white evangelicals even now. And so they did 2 surveys, one in March of last year, and just released another one that pretty much basically shows it's stayed the same, in some cases have strengthened. And so all that to say, when you're looking at those particular theories, in hindsight, we could point out, oh, this was QAnon. But I think knowing, at least in my experience, pointing to that was QAnon, I don't think I would have said that. And I don't think even those who are maybe going in that direction would have embraced this wholesale idea of Q and this idea of, those cryptic codes. It was all very disparate and all very wrapped up in the moment of how to negotiate and how to explain the unexplainable and how to deal with these claims of election fraud or the necessity to avoid any conversation about race and the protests and the violence that America saw during that summer. So conspiracy theories, I like to say it was more of a conspiratorial mindset that kind of picked and chose. And it's only in hindsight that I think our surveys sociologically and research is kind of able to pinpoint a more defined, probably more academic matrix to understand those things. But on the ground, it wasn't a full-blown Q. I think that came it was there, but in terms of its saturation, it's not something I experienced full bore. It was only looking back, being able to point out, okay, this was a Q type theory. This was, those kind of things. So as it saturated society, you can look back and see that a little clearer.
Sure. So yes, maybe QAnon at that time was still a bit more underground, a bit more dark web, connected with 4chan and so on. So did you see an explicit link between the Trump presidential campaign, conspiracy theories, and evangelicalism?
Yes and no. I think it's important to say maybe two things. That first, conspiracies and American society do go way back. And so I think we need to be honest enough to say the paranoid style, going back of Richard Hofstadter, and some of these ideas that people have pinpointed in American society in general. Evangelicals, just by virtue of the fact that we are American evangelicals, have been influenced and shaped by these particular postures and patterns of thinking. Especially with, and I would say it's not necessarily an evangelical problem for the rise of alternative or fake news. That was something that Donald Trump specifically, he didn't invent it, but he perfected it for the digital world. And that's not necessarily something that I would say, well, that's a problem specifically caused by, holding to an evangelical Christianity. However, I think when you combine that feeling of distrust, which may even slide into not clinical paranoia, but paranoid holding of that, when you believe you're being lied to, and like right-wing conservative radio has developed that posture among predominantly conservative Americans for decades now, when you believe you're being lied to or not being told the truth, that's not necessarily an evangelical issue. However, where that intersects, I think, with Christianity and holding to an evangelical faith is that we have this idea that Christianity does offer, right, an alternative explanation of reality. And so without a critical understanding of how those two things intersect, you can very easily make this move to say, well, because the resurrection of Jesus is an alternative explanation for why the world is the way that it is in reality, we can automatically maybe make that that characteristic move to say, oh, well, anything that's alternative must be more plausible than not. And so I'm drawing a little bit off of Lauren Winner's concept of characteristic damage, where she talks about the way that we hold doctrine can cause damage characteristic of itself. And so this idea that Christianity provides an alternative explanation of reality, life, death, resurrection, these ultimate things, I think without a critical conversation about information and epistemology, I think there's something that can be said for how Christianity can intersect with a moment of distrust and paranoia that unfortunately reinforces this idea that, well, if it's alternative, it must be true. And so I think it's an important critical path to take and explore, and one that simply just doesn't hold up a straw man of white evangelicals or evangelicals in the United States and say, you believe this because of this straw man version I have of you. But I think on the other hand, we need to be honest enough to say that the sociological surveys do point to white evangelicals holding to these things a little bit more. And I'm not one to sit here and say we should mount a no true Scotsman defense of the evangelical movement just by virtue of the fact that we would admit, well, no true evangelical would believe those things. Well, that's when it gets into, there are people who identify as an evangelical, whatever that has come to mean, that find these things not only plausible, but believable. And because they're having a real world effect, that means that we should at least, this is some immediacy to answering this question for the sake of democracy and really for the witness of evangelical Christianity in America. So that was a long explanation, but to answer your question, yes and no. There are ways in which fake news and alternative explanations are beyond the problem of just evangelical Christians. But there is a way that characteristically, as we hold our faith, we can make a jump. It's a wrong move. It's not a good move to say, well, an alternative explanation must give plausibility to other alternative explanations about vaccines, about elections and politics and things like that. So it's an epistemological problem. It's also a theological problem. And there's a lot of intersections that we need to attend to in order to get some better reparative answers that doesn't descend into polemics and hatred. And that's difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got two strands there, both that religious belief in itself is saying something that's alternative, and so in that sense kind of opens you up to these potential conspiracy theories, and then at the same time you've got the people who want to say, oh no, but that's not really our religion or our interpretation of religion, but actually evangelicals are the people who identify as evangelicals, and so yeah, you have to take that seriously. Okay, so in terms of the church you were in at the time, how do you explain the way conspiracy theories took hold specifically in your church? And was there something, in that church that was leaning in that direction?
I think when the stories you see on the national media become home, there were Black Lives Matter demonstrations. There were things that were not just mediated by screens. And that pressure demands a response in particular ways. And so there's one thing to watch the news, to receive ideological talking points and how to process and mediate these things. There's another when it comes home and you're having to explain and navigate and negotiate these things. And so that was particularly one when the demonstrations, and there were also interactions or conflict with our local police station and things like that, that really pushed people to a breaking point to try to explain these things. And I don't have to mention, but I will, just the simple fact that where we were was very close to the DC metro area. There's, there was a train stop there. So the reality of what was going on in DC was, extended out into that community too. And so as much as I say what's going on in the national world is not necessarily what's going on local, and sometimes the national comes local, well, when you're living in the shadow of the United States Capitol, what is national is local too. And so those two dynamics really combined. And I would be very clear and state that there's what gets published or what gets promoted in particular environments, faith environments, where it's from the pulpit and it's very explicit. Where I was focused with young adults and 20 and 30 somethings, you're talking less about this dynamic of extremism. You're talking more about a dynamic of plausibility and respectability. And that has a very real effect, though, on the faith of 20 and 30 somethings who are essentially holding out this, if I follow Jesus, if I press into Christian formation, is this what I'm going to come out with? And they find these things navigating a different digital world than perhaps older generations. And just the way our algorithms work, we're dealing with something that I think we don't fully understand or control. We can't control. So when we have these different information inputs and things like that, you start to, and that was one particular thing I noticed, was the generational difference and divide, and saying, we have to be able to not negotiate, but we have to be able to figure out how to speak in a way that addresses these things, because it is creating a theological formation crisis when it comes to the faith of 20 and 30 somethings and how they're processing these conversations about justice, these conversations about politics and all of those things. And so those are all incredibly theological, but it doesn't always sound like that when you bring up the issue.
So can I push you a bit further on the issue of whiteness, and perhaps from an American perspective? You can sort of explain to us a bit more why the Black Lives Matter protests are sort of demonized in this way by the white church. Why is that seen as so threatening, rather than saying, oh my goodness, we still have a race problem? Why are Black Lives Matter protests seen as a threat? Why demonize Antifa? Surely if you're not anti-fascist, you're pro-fascist, and people actually admitting to that. So perhaps you could tease that out for us a little bit.
I mean, I can do so personally, is that I think my journey, especially in New Orleans, I came face to face with the distinction between what it was to be white and what that entailed. And I will preface that by again saying that I'm still constantly in that posture of understanding just what that is and what it means. And that journey began by simply that reaction, speaking honestly, that reaction or revulsion to say, well, what do you mean white? That sounds racist. That was an initial reaction that, very honestly, Esther, is baked in that type of environment. So the reaction to a Black Lives Matter, to say, and I would just simply say this, all lives matter. Well, that is whiteness communicating itself. And so when you look at inside the church context, one of the best helpful questions to push me into this area was asked to me by a Hispanic pastor. And he said, if I were to ask you to describe African American preaching, what would you do? How would you describe it? And I listed off some descriptors, and he goes, now describe white preaching. And at that point, I knew the question that he was getting at. And it was because the normative qualities of whiteness had existed, right, in this basic gaze, right? The white, the colonizer's gaze, you are able, quote unquote, to perceive the motives and the realities of others while holding yourself at a distance objectively from them. And to the extent that we're seeing that dynamic, unfortunately, repeat itself through Black Lives Matter, I think it just raises the critical importance of having these necessary conversations. But the reality, particularly among evangelical churches, that I think makes this such a difficult reality is the emphasis on personal piety that is distinct and distinctive of the evangelical Christianity. Going back to the Great Awakenings, is there was always this focus, right, on living a life that has the evidence of an encounter with Jesus Christ. Well, when that gets reduced to personal piety, then the question of racism is basically reduced to personal behavior between people, and not fully embracing what I believe to be the Bible's actually complete vision of how sin manifests itself systemically and can perpetuate itself by the way we fashion and order society. That's very clear to me. But held in a particular way in the South, that doesn't get heard for 1,000 different commitments and reasons, that makes it seem as though it is coming from a political foundation rather than a theological foundation. And so the resistance to Black Lives Matter seems like it comes from a theological foundation, but that theological foundation within those spaces has been conditioned, contoured over and over and over again by a political or socio-political experiment in the United States that has been marked by white supremacy. And unfortunately, when we look at that and we equate white supremacy with hoods and robes, but the reality of our justice system would say otherwise. And that's just one example. So I hope that kind of pushes farther into it.
Yeah, sure. So there's still that blindness to white privilege and that lack of acknowledgement of institutional racism in the church and in theology, you know, as well as in politics. So what concerned you about what you were hearing in the church, to the extent that you then raised the issue of growing conspiracy theories with the leaders in your church, and how did they respond?
Yeah, I mean, it when you look and think back on it, it was one giant wave. I mean, it wasn't just conspiracies. It was the host of issues that conspiracies were a response to, right? The move towards conspiracies was a move that was away from necessary conversations surrounding race, surrounding Christian presence in politics and engagement with politics and what that looked like. And so the conspiratorial move was a symptom, was a strategy that in many ways avoided a conversation about particular things. And so, you know, when bringing it up, you're not necessarily bringing up people's flight from those realities. You're bringing up the particular issues that they're fleeing from. And conspiracies get caught up in that as a way to negotiate or deal with it. and so it's a very powerful relationship between these two, the issues at hand, and then how people navigate or negotiate with them. And by and large, I think coming out of that tradition and that particular stream, the response did not necessarily surprise me. I think one of the things that I've since learned and been able to articulate that I couldn't then is that it's very common in particular spaces within the white church, within white evangelicalism, to have this notion of piety, of personal piety, but it's a piety that that hides our politics. It's a respectability that says, and maybe perhaps even a form of privilege, to say, oh, we don't talk politics. And there's ways that could be seen as privilege, absolutely. There's also ways theologically where that can be construed as, well, you're valuing personal piety and defining racism or these things as, well, it's only personally expressed and not collectively contributed. So being able to look at those realities and those moves and say, we don't talk politics here, when really that move hides an interrogation process that needs to happen with our politics. And so it keeps theology from interrogating a political alliance or allegiance. And so that was one dynamic, and it wasn't necessarily surprising to pretty much say, you can't talk about injustice. You should watch using that particular word because of how it might elicit a particular reaction from people. And that statement is in and of itself reactionary, right? And saying, well, we don't want to offend particular people or their sensibilities or their respectabilities. And so it has everything to say with recognizing what is the word that needs to go out to a particular group of people in time, and what is that particular group of people need to hear from the word. And that's the tension and the challenge and the call of ministry. And that was the response. And I wasn't in a place to affect that change. And that's as simple as that. I can respect that enough to say wasn't my call, and that's okay.
Okay, but at the same time, you felt like it was an inadequate response and decided to leave. So, so when did you decide to leave, and how difficult was that a decision for you to make?
We decided to leave before 2020.
Mm-hmm.
I should be very clear about that. Everything was moving and heading towards that direction. I think a lot of what 2020 accomplished was to confirm the challenges of the tradition, and the problems ran deeper than our previous experience with the tradition might have suggested. And so leaving was difficult, if only because the getting tied up in authority and getting tied up in what it would construe to look at a tradition and basically say it might be remaining faithful to following Jesus and the word as you understand it, brings you to a point of separation rather than continuing. And that is just personally not a place I ever thought I would go or be. And yet it was unavoidable. I mean, if you can't unsee certain things, you can't unhear certain things and certain stories and certain people, that those happened and they were real. And when I say that, I'm talking about people that we met in New Orleans. I'm talking about people within the tradition, mavericks, right, who kind of asked us uncomfortable questions, like my Hispanic friend. You can't undo that process. And so, yes, it was difficult. No, we didn't know how unyielding the tradition itself was. We found out a little bit more what that looked like in 2020. But I still stand here and wonder, and also say that I do think much of what evangelical Christianity has become globally can effectively criticize in a restorative and reparative way what has become of the movement within the United States, particularly within white evangelicalism. And so the idea of deconstruction, which someone may hear what I'm describing and say, yeah, that's deconstruction. Moving out of evangelical Christianity without allowing the voices of minorities to speak into that process is a massive, massive neglect, and it basically duplicates the error of an evangelical Christianity in the United States to where it got to in the first place. And so that's been part of the journey and part of reckoning and wrestling with that tradition. But we had planned on making the move sooner, and 2020 happened, and things developed in a way where it happened in the right way. Personally, we had things as a family we adopted during that process. So there were a lot of good things that happened that basically we look at and say, well, it could not have been any other way. And on the way out, you learned that the challenges were deeper but also require more reflection than previously thought.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and at that point, did you have Scotland and Aberdeen University in mind, or were you just thinking, we need to get out of America, where do we go?
Yeah, no, I mean, Aberdeen, you're living in the UK and Aberdeen, that was something that was always in the background. The story of how we got here basically just amounted to looking at faculty pages and saying, oh, I'd like to study with him. I'd like to study with her. Let me send an email. And so it was somewhat coincidental, but looking back, maybe providential in how we ended up here. But I would also be very honest and open and say there were certainly scrambling and this idea of are we crazy? Are we crazy? And that need to process that was real and challenging. I'm stumbling for words because it's still very much something that you process and looking for what does health look like. And so, those are all good, necessary things, good and necessary things, and nothing is wasted. I do believe that. And so coming to grips with what that looks like, I'll let you know.
But yeah, so you've been there a year now, and you seem to have settled in, seem to be surviving in Scotland, in Aberdeen. So after you moved, you were then watching the insurrection at the Capitol, presumably on TV, on social media. Were you thinking, yeah, this is where we thought this is heading, this is why we got out, or was it still a total shock at that time? What were you thinking and feeling as you saw that happen? And do you think church leaders bear some responsibility for what happened there?
When I saw what was going on, we were still in the States, so it was.
Oh, right, you're from the States.
It was 40 miles up the road. The first thought was basically, do I know anyone there? The distance was not far. So that was very much a real possibility. I was not surprised. I was shocked, I think, with a lot of Americans at how far it got. I wasn't surprised by the rhetoric. I wasn't surprised by the stirring up of the crowd. None of those things were surprising. The lack of response, basically, I don't think it was in my consciousness that the Capitol building could be entered. I didn't think that was a possibility. And so that was shocking. You asked a question if I thought church leaders bear responsibility. I would not presume to necessarily say that from our particular context. And on the other hand, I don't necessarily know if I could presume to speak for an entire movement in the United States at that point too. I think what I can say is someone who very much would maybe who has seen or sat in particular services and sat in spaces where this idea that we need to take back America, this idea that we are a Christian country, right? That was something that happened in 2020 where a video was shown that basically was it was pseudo history describing almost conspiratorially this effort to stamp out America's Christian heritage and pointing to the various designs of DC as evidence of this long lost Christian America. Basically talking about the Puritan synthesis as totally determinative for the construction of America. And so the challenge is when that's your history, right? When that's the narrative you've embraced and everything else is revisionist, when you're confusing how you hold the scriptures with the discipline of history and revising and doing the discipline well. The seeds for January 6th were there for a long time. They were there in churches. They're not in churches that are always militant, giving away AR-15s every Sunday. That we need to be honest enough. So this is where I would say, in terms of responsibility, when I say we, I'm talking about anyone who would maybe fit Bevington's those quadrilateral for what an evangelical theologically looks like. Regardless of how it's defined sociologically, if you follow Jesus in America, you cannot presume that your non-Christian neighbors would be able to parse the difference between your Christianity and the Christianity on display at January 6th. It's as simple as that. I have no desire to deny or to placate some kind of responsibility. I wasn't there for January 6th. I don't support that. But as someone who cares about following Jesus in America, and someone who would not expect my neighbor who is not a Christian to know the difference, I don't know what we stand to lose from not saying at some point the church was involved here. We don't know exactly how, but it's clear that we have work to do in our theological inheritance, and the only gain from that is health. The only gain from making that admission is health. Because of the explicit signs and links to Donald Trump and this idea, and I've said this before, but for Christians to look at January 6th as partly our responsibility, I think means looking at it as a theological event, that it was a failed apocalypse. And that doesn't mean that we look at every church in America and say, yes, you fomented insurrection. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that in terms of the work of theology and witness in America, it begins an apology for Christianity's continued influence and state in the public square in America really does begin with the work of performing an autopsy on how a particular expression of Christianity in America displayed itself. And I'm not interested in saying, well, no true evangelical would be there. I don't expect my neighbor to know the difference. And I gain everything by making an admission that there's something about the way that we express Christianity in particular spaces that fueled that. And we may not necessarily have found ourselves there. It may be abhorrent to us, but personal complicity and corporate complicity are two different things. And I think we see a very clear line in scripture where Daniel's praying and confessing the sins of his people. There's an opportunity for that. But when you believe racism is not systemic and neither is sin, then it's hard to confess the sins of your people too.
Sure. So, and maybe, your PhD work now is part of that autopsy. Yes. So before we move to questions from the audience, and just a reminder to the audience that you can type your questions in the Q&A, just tell us a bit more about your research now. What is it that you're discovering? What is or isn't surprising you? And how do you think church leaders ought to respond to where America is now?
I'm learning a lot. I think one of the things I'm doing and spent the last year doing is really engaging with evangelical historiography. One particular book has made this discipline go mainstream, and it's Jesus and John Wayne. And that book is part of a massive body of scholarship, of which yours is also, Esther. And so being able to help people understand that what Dumais is doing has been going on for 50, 60 years in terms of evangelicals. And so to presume that we could simply maybe rebrand as evangelicals very quickly instead of doing some work on our theological inheritance, I think is presumptuous. And historiography helps us know ourselves a little bit better. Even if we may not always agree or dispute, critical interpretations of particular events, that's the work And that's what I'm learning, is that's the work. And so, but I'm not a historian. I'm doing this as a theologian.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to think about conspiracies as a theological problem, I've found myself diving into the work and trying to form paranoia as a theological concept, a conceptualization of paranoia as opposed to metanoia, which was where the New Testament gets our word for repentance. And so that's currently the road I'm going down. I'm looking at the Great Awakenings, the origin of evangelicals in America,
Mm-hmm.
and this idea that paranoia, theologically conceived, may lead to this idea of a split, right? A split mind or a split world. And I do think that split worldness does work really well with the work of Willie Jennings and others who have postulated how race and theology have formed together in white supremacist colonialist ways. And so looking at evangelicalism in America and this idea of a paranoia that creates artificial worlds and conspiracies is kind of a Gnostic movement between worlds. That's where my research is heading. I do think that offering theological answers and repair is crucial and important, but also doing it in a way where I'm not holding up people in contempt, as I think there's a very Christian way of going about this as a theologian. And I don't want to necessarily lose the integrity of what it means to follow Jesus as a Christian in doing work that basically ends up holding neighbors in contempt. And so that's a very fine line, but it's gratefully one that I think my supervisors are keeping me to. And so I'm grateful and glad for that. And that's partly what they're there for, among many other things. But I'm glad to be here and answering these questions. So. Oh.
The audience, so we'll move on to those now. So the first question is, what influence do you ascribe to prophecy and publicity around prophecies?
Great question. I think the historic inheritance of evangelicals, I mean, looking at the history can help parse how prophecy has basically been reduced to predictive notions about geopolitics. The fundamentalists of the turn of the 20th century were very, I mean, this was a large part of their eschatology. And to be honest with you, the global events now, I would postulate that we're going to see a resurgence of this type of prophecy, which is basically predicting geopolitical events as a way to affirm theology. So when we go back to America in 2020, obviously the predictions about Donald Trump and things like that, I think maybe playing their own game, if you follow what the scripture says about those particular kinds of predictions. The Bible does lay out in various places what happens when those type of predictions don't come to pass. So I think we need to be careful and distinguish and delineate what we mean by prophecy. And I would, but it does feature prominently, particularly in a dispensational eschatology. So I don't want to downplay that. I think that's a good question, and it's very much a part of that inheritance.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a question digging a bit deeper into white evangelical Christianity. Can you be a white evangelical Christian and not be racist or Islamophobic? You know, in relation to the sort of conspiracies you're thinking about?
Yeah, this is a good question. I don't know where the quote came from, but I like it. Someone once said, trying to locate a white American evangelical is a little bit like nailing gelatin to a wall. Mm-hmm. You're right to say that, you know, perhaps it's not as monolithic as we might assume it is. And I see, you know, is it possible that they are not racist or not Islamophobic? And I would certainly say yes. I mean, that's you know, particularly true. And I think when it comes to defining who white evangelicals are, the way that historians have attempted to answer that question goes into many different directions. And so the question that you're asking, can people individually not promote these views? Well, the answer is yes. But Jamar Tisby has a great question about, and I think it illustrates the nature of your question. He said, you know, answering the question, are African-American evangelicals actually evangelicals? are Black Christians evangelicals? And the way that he answered it was, the better question is asking, what are the ways white evangelicals have drawn boundaries as a way to keep Black evangelicals from becoming part of this particular sociocultural movement? And so it is monolithic in certain ways, and discovering the ways in which it attempts to be monolithic, I think, helps us understand the distinguishing factors between someone personally identifying as a white evangelical, whatever that means, but also participating in a tradition where, spent long enough, you do start to be formed in a particular teaching, to maybe not embrace these particular views, but also maybe to see them as non-issues in a way that develops a complicity that just does not see them as something to be challenged or confronted. And so that's a good question, Pauline. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question is asking whether there are theological responses from other expressions of Christianity in America. How do they respond to the attitudes of white evangelical Christians, particularly in relation to Black Lives Matter?
So I think, if I'm understanding the question right, you're asking, are there theological critiques of white evangelical responses to Black Lives Matter? Is that the question? I hope that's what I'm going to answer. I would actually point within the broader evangelical movement in the United States to say, yes, like there are stringent critiques of white evangelicals by minority evangelicals. So not even going into the mainline denominations, but keeping within that global maybe perspective of evangelical Christianity. We're seeing moves of minorities, like pastors like Duke Kwan, who essentially have said, like, the idea of this social cultural label does not constitute the theological understanding that I have of what it is to be evangelical. So we don't have to go very far, I think, to locate evangelicals who maybe they're not white evangelicals, but would say, Black Lives Matter. If you have a problem saying these three words, if you can't say those, how can we parse doctrines like the Trinity and things like that? So that's one maybe quip that you can say quickly to that response. But I would also point internally, even my experience within the Southern Baptist Convention. So there are pastors, African American and white pastors and other minorities, who are raising this as an issue, that there does need to be racial reconciliation. The speed in which Southern Baptists went public and condemned critical race theory far outpaced work towards the theological concept of reconciliation, right? So the speed in which white evangelicals deny or close off particular conversations about critical reflections on race in America, that moves way faster and way quicker than actually sitting down and working through what it means to follow Jesus in a racialized society in America. That's slow. The move towards politicized movements like the CRT hysteria is telling. And so you're seeing this not in and out evangelicalism, you're seeing it within evangelicalism itself. And so as someone who would maybe still use that term with the qualification that I can define it, I would point to the fact that there's conflict within the evangelical Christianity in the United States as not as a death knell for evangelical theology. But that's not to negate the fact that people who reject CRT or these conversations, it's not to say they don't have theological reasons for doing so. And I think it's important that we admit that. So that was a good question. I hope I understood it correctly. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so we need to interrogate that theology itself that's underpinning these issues. And currently now, we're getting news here of various books being banned in America, again, which seems to be coming from a particular version of evangelical theology.
Incidentally enough, that you mentioned it, I mean, one of the ones that was publicized was in the county that we left.
Right.
So these things are not, they can't be isolated like we might expect. I say expect, no one necessarily expects that, it's all mixed together, but maybe a particular privileged evangelical approach sociocultural approach that does neatly separate politics from, this idea of middle-class respectability. But when you look at what's actually going on in these communities, you have Republican officials running on election integrity, which is code for election fraud. And then you have school boards that are, banning books. And then you have churches that are saying no to Black Lives Matter. And so there's a lot of conversation that's distracting. They perceive it's coming from a political standpoint, and so they can reject it. But really what's happening is we're cutting ourselves off from a theological conversation, and hiding our politics behind our piety. But you're right, Esther. I mean, there's theology there that needs interrogating that we can't get at because of a myriad of reasons. But predominantly among those is this idea that it proceeds from a strictly secular, quote unquote, and also quote unquote political ideology, which is pertinent to the issues facing Southern Baptist Convention right now.
Well, yeah, so related to that, we have a follow-up question that's asking, how do we open up that dialogue? How do you engage theologically with white evangelicalism in the way so that you can do that theological work?
I hope my thesis answers that question. I do think the first thing I would say, and my supervisor said this last week, so I'll just quote Tom Greggs because he said it and it's true. A lot of this has to stay on the ground. If we're serious about challenging and changing people's minds, it has to stay on the ground. And I think first and foremost, it's this idea that right now, at least the flavor in American society is that everyone loves to hate on white evangelicals. And to be honest with you, I do understand that posture, especially if there's an uncritical reception of the evangelical tradition that basically amounts to doing history as a form of brand PR rather than a critical reflection of our own tradition. And so I think you ask, how do you challenge that? Well, I can tell you one thing I'm trying to do is trying to keep myself firmly planted as a white evangelical and someone who's trying to speak honestly about the tradition that shaped me, to not try and hold white evangelicals up for contempt, kind of remembering what Bonhoeffer said, his fellow German Christians. He wrote a brilliant essay that I've been commending all year, after 10 years. And he described German Christians who went after Hitler. He said, stupidity is more dangerous than malice. And against stupidity, we are defenseless. And then he checks himself and he says, but nothing we despise in the other is in itself foreign to us. And so there is a very strong, I think, perception among white evangelicals that they are hated. And that fuels this idea of a persecution complex, which, real or unreal, is a very powerful indicator of how we might receive these critiques. And so wiggling through that and planting yourself firmly, I'm taking Tom's advice to heart and saying this needs to stay on the ground and needs to be said not as a polemic or not as an attack, but reparative and restorative. And so I think the other part of that is holding that out in hope. I know that sounds maybe preaching, but at the same time, if we aren't having hope, I'm not necessarily sure we're doing Christian theology. And so this idea of shutting the door on fellow human beings, either in contempt or cynicism, is not really something that the work of theology allows us or leads us to do, if it's done with Jesus Christ at the center. So I don't know if that's as practical as you were hoping for, but I would be hesitant to claim to have figured that out this early in the process. But I think it does in part come from receiving the necessary correction and criticism that has been offered for hundreds of years by global Christians. I cannot overstate that point enough. It's not going to come necessarily from people like me. Although I'm in the tradition of the one thing I found is that the voices who have been isolated and put off to the margins have been saying this stuff for decades, for centuries. And even just recently in our own tradition, I'm pointing at names like Tom Skinner, Tom Skinner and Renee Padilla, these men have been speaking critiques and have just not been heard, but they're global. So I would just probably end with that. That needs to happen.
Okay, yeah, and that is the persecution complex feeds a certain sort of theology as well, that, you know, if we're being persecuted, then we're doing the right thing. So then that doesn't help to encourage any self-reflection and deeper digging and maybe changing the way you're doing things. Okay, so we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to take two questions together so you can choose, you know, how to respond and whether the responses are related. So one is, what's your take on the attitude of white evangelicals towards climate change? And the other is, what's the response of white evangelicals to the current invasion of Ukraine by Russia?
Both great questions. And I do think that my particular choice of conspiracies probably speaks to both of these. As far as climate change goes, I can only speak maybe as someone who's been in the tradition. I can tell you two things. Number one, I never taught on climate change. And I also never heard a sermon on climate change. And so those two things can probably inform maybe how you'd perceive the take. I'm not saying that there aren't white evangelicals who are speaking. There are. It was just simply in the stream that I was in. Those tributaries were dammed off. And so I can't claim to necessarily speak for all white evangelicals and say, you know, this is their response. But there is, and I could say this, is that there is, historically speaking, has always been an evangelical left. And this idea, and I just personally say from moving here to Scotland, I think that's one of the things that I've been confronted with wholesale, is the watching the response of fellow citizens here to work towards that end. I think it's been something, I mean, we just had COP right here in Glasgow. And so watching the response of Christians here has been convicting, but also encouraging in that end. So you're asking a question that I think is personally part of why I'm here, and to sharpen and look at what it is to follow Jesus in the world that we live in. Because conspiratorially, climate change is not necessarily something that evangelicals of a particular disposition politically would be disposed to believe and buy as legitimate. And all you need to do is look at the GOP response to the State of the Union last night to maybe ascertain that. Pauline, you asked about the invasion of Ukraine. Unfortunately, I'm not as connected with these circles. I'm not going to say I'm on Twitter. That doesn't count necessarily. Twitter hot takes can't speak for a movement. So I don't know. And I think I'm going to leave it there. But I do think it's the right question to ask when the time is right, to be able to better understand the movement. But probably like you all, I think I've just spent the last couple days just horrified at what we're seeing. And obviously our support is for the people that are in harm's way and on that war path. But it'll be a question for another time, I'm sure.
Okay. Yeah. On that note, Jared, yeah, we all hope that for some peaceful resolution in Ukraine, and that doesn't look likely at the moment, and it all does look pretty horrifying. But thank you so much for engaging in this conversation on these very important topics. Thank you too for the audience, for listening, for participating. And if you've enjoyed this webinar, do join us again. You can check out our schedule of events on the Centre for Religion in Society website. For now, I have to end this meeting. We could have talked longer, but time is against us. Thank you very much, Jared.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you for having me.